I thought I was calling an electrician to fix a flickering light. A small inconvenience. Something ordinary. I never imagined that opening my front door that evening would quietly fracture the stillness of my life and reshape my nights forever. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which city you're listening from. It truly matters to us. Now, sit back and listen closely. That evening lives inside me with unsettling clarity, as though time decided to etch it into my memory rather than let it fade. The sky outside my windows had taken on that uneasy pink, gray hue that comes just before dusk, the kind that feels gentle at first, then slowly presses on your chest for reasons you can't explain. The living room light had been flickering for days. Brief moments of darkness, followed by weak bursts of illumination, as if the room itself were struggling to stay awake. At 86, life had become beautifully predictable. Mornings had their rituals. Evenings had their silence. I cherished that calm. The flickerant light felt like a disruption, small yes, but persistent. A reminder that even quiet lives are not immune to interruption. I stood there with the phone in my hand longer than necessary, staring at the number of the electrician I'd used months earlier. My fingers hesitated. Finally I dialed. The voice on the other end was polite, efficient, reassuring. Someone would be there within the hour. I thanked him and hung up, unaware that I had just invited change across my threshold. I straightened the cushions, folded a throw blanket. These small gestures of control soothed me as the heater hummed softly in the background and the light continued its restless blinking. Time stretched. Each minute felt heavier than the last. Then, just as the sun slipped behind the rooftops and shadows began claiming the street, there came a knock. My heart jumped, not with fear, but with a strange anticipation I hadn't felt in years. I expected reality. A man with tired eyes, a uniform, a toolbox. When I opened the door, routine vanished. He stood there tall and broad-shouldered, filling the doorway as if the space itself had adjusted to accommodate him. A stranger, younger than I expected. His presence was immediate, undeniable. For a moment my breath caught. He smiled, warm, unforced, and somehow that single expression steadied me. "Hi," he said, gesturing lightly toward the inside of the house. "I'm here about the light." His voice was calm though grounded. Not rushed, not careless. I nodded, realizing I'd forgotten how to speak. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and the way he stood, relaxed yet attentive, carried a quiet confidence that felt both reassuring and disarming. "I'm Jordan," he said, extending his hand. When I took it, I noticed the pressure firm, respectful, measured. Not the grip of someone trying to impress, nor someone distant. It was as though he instinctively understood where boundaries lived, and how to honor them. I had no way of knowing then that this brief exchange, this ordinary introduction, would mark the beginning of something far more complicated than a faulty light. Something that would follow me long after the evening ended, and refused to let my silence remain untouched. "I was sent instead of the electrician you were expecting," he added, a faint trace of humor slipping into his voice, as though he sensed the surprise still settling in my expression. I laughed, soft, slightly unsteady, more to steady myself than out of amusement. "Well," I said, trying to sound casual, "I suppose a little extra muscle won't hurt." Jordan smiled at that, a low chuckle escaping him as I stepped aside to let him in. The moment he crossed the apartment seemed to shift. Not smaller exactly, but altered. As if the air itself had become more alert, more aware of his presence. I caught myself noticing details I hadn't meant to notice. The way his shoulders moved beneath his shirt, controlled and deliberate. The quiet attentiveness in his eyes as he took in the room. The ease with which he filled the silence while setting down his tools, never forcing conversation, never letting it drop entirely. As he worked, testing the fixture, replacing bulbs, checking the wiring, we talked. At first, it was safe conversation, polite questions, measured answers. Two strangers circling the edges of familiarity. He asked about my favorite books, about the small garden I tended outside the window, about the streets I'd walked for decades, watching generations come and go. I answered carefully at first, as though each word needed permission. But gradually, something loosened. Warmth crept into my voice, surprising even me. What struck me most was how he listened. Truly listened, no hurried nods, no distracted glances. Just attention, steady and unbroken. There was something grounding in the way he worked. The precise movements of his hands paired with that quiet focus. And somewhere in the middle of it all, I became aware of my heart beating a little faster. Not from fear, from recognition. From the strange realization that being seen, really seen, could still awaken something I had long believed time had sealed away. We laughed over small things. A stubborn fixture that refused cooperation. The age of my furniture. The peculiar way cats seem to observe humans with silent judgment from corners of rooms. It was ordinary. And yet beneath it all, there was a subtle current. Something charged but unspoken, humming just beneath the surface. At one point, Jordan stopped and looked at me. Not abruptly, not intrusively. Just fully. "You've kept this place beautiful," he said quietly. The words landed deeper than they should have. I felt them settle somewhere tender, somewhere exposed. I thanked him, but my response carried more than gratitude. It carried a fragment of truth I rarely shared, a brief, unguarded glimpse of the loneliness I had learned to hold without complaint. And for reasons I couldn't yet explain, it felt less heavy simply because he had noticed. By the time the light was finally fixed, dusk had settled fully into night. And the room was filled with a steady, reassuring glow. The erratic flicker was gone. In its place lingered something softer. An unspoken warmth that seemed to hover between us, as if the air itself had absorbed the moment. Jordan gathered his tools with unhurried movements. For a brief instant, neither of us spoke. The silence carried weight, not awkward, but charged, as though something unfinished had been quietly acknowledged. "Thank you," I said at last, aware that the words reached beyond the repair of a faulty light. He looked up and smiled, that same calm confidence returning. The kind that had settled into the room the moment he arrived. "My pleasure," he replied. I surprised myself by wishing for a reason, any reason. To hear him say it again. When he stepped outside and disappeared down the hallway, I closed the door and leaned against it. My thoughts replaying fragments of the evening, the conversation, the glances, the easy warmth that had taken root without asking permission. It had been an ordinary visit. A simple repair. And yet it felt as though something within me had quietly opened. Something I hadn't realized I'd kept sealed for decades. There was a subtle tension left behind, a faint suggestion of possibility. It pressed gently against my chest, aching in a way that felt unfamiliar and oddly welcome. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the night settle over the familiar streets. The world outside was unchanged, but inside something had shifted. I thought of Jordan. Of how an ordinary evening had unfolded into something unexpectedly meaningful. And in that quiet moment, I understood that life, even at 86, still carried its own kind of magic, soft, unannounced, patient. I smiled to myself, aware that my world felt, if only slightly, brighter than it had the day before. The next morning, the memory of his visit lingered like sunlight slipping through a curtain left just ajar. Gentle, persistent, impossible to dismiss. I woke earlier than usual, not from urgency, but because my thoughts refused to settle back into routine. The once annoying flickering light had transformed into a reminder. Not of inconvenience, but of curiosity. And of something warmer beneath it. A feeling I hadn't allowed myself to consider in years. I moved through my morning slowly, deliberately. The kettle hissed. My cat brushed past my legs. The scent of tea filled the kitchen. Each small sound and motion felt sharper, more present. And beneath it all was a quiet restlessness. A soft ache of anticipation, suggesting that something had begun, even if I couldn't yet name it. I couldn't stop thinking about his presence. The warmth in his gaze, the careful, almost reverent attention he gave even the smallest task. The memory lingered, threading itself through my thoughts as the morning wore on. Then, close to midday, there came another knock at the door. I stilled, my breath catching in a way that felt unfamiliar and faintly thrilling. For a brief, irrational second, I wondered if it could truly be him again. When I opened the door, my doubt dissolved. Jordan stood there, relaxed and smiling, a small package held loosely in his hand. "Good morning," he said. His voice carried the same calm reassurance, the same quiet charm that had unsettled me so pleasantly the night before. I realized I forgot one of the connectors for your light fixture. I thought I'd drop it off before heading to my next job. I stepped aside, inviting him in. He paused, polite, measured, then crossed the threshold, brushing past me with a careful awareness of space that somehow made the moment feel charged. "Thank you," I said, accepting the small package. Our fingers touched briefly. Just a fraction of a second. And yet the familiar spark returned. Subtle but undeniable. It was absurd, I knew, a simple exchange, but my pulse quickened all the same. Jordan glanced around the room, taking everything in with unhurried attention. He nodded softly. "You've got a lovely place," he said, his eyes lingering on the framed photographs. The carefully arranged trinkets, the furniture softened by decades of use. There was no judgment in his tone, no indulgent amusement, only genuine appreciation. I smiled, feeling unexpectedly shy. "It's old," I said, then added, "and it's mine." The words felt more revealing than I had intended. A quiet pause settled between us, the kind that doesn't rush to be filled. In that moment, it felt as though Jordan had stepped into more than just my living room. He had crossed into a private, carefully guarded corner of my life. He leaned lightly against the counter, casual yet intentional. "I like noticing the things people hold on to," he said. "They say more about someone than words ever do." His gaze met mine, steady, unflinching. And instead of feeling exposed, I felt something closer to comfort. As though, for the first time in a long while, someone was seeing me clearly. Without expectation, without pretense. We began with quiet, ordinary conversation, the weather, the neighborhood, the peculiar habits of old houses that seemed to creak and sigh like living things. Slowly, almost without noticing, the talk deepened. He asked about my life. About the small satisfactions I had learned to find in routine, in solitude, in days that no longer rushed me. I found myself answering honestly. Sharing pieces of myself I hadn't put into words for years. Stories of travels taken long ago, books that had once shaped the way I saw the world. Moments that had brought laughter, and others that had taught me how to sit with silence. Jordan listened without distraction, his attention steady, unbroken. As if every detail mattered. And in that attentive stillness, I felt a quiet jolt of surprise. I hadn't expected to feel so understood by someone I barely knew. Yet there it was, a connection forming, gentle but undeniable. Not romance, not yet, something subtler, a recognition. A shared humanity that carried its own intimacy. At one point, he mentioned a few small repairs he'd noticed, things I had meant to address for months. He offered to take care of them. I hesitated, not because I mistrusted him, but because inviting someone further into my space felt strangely vulnerable. The thought was both exhilarating and unsettling. His smile was patient, reassuring, it tipped the balance. The next hour passed in quiet cooperation. We moved through the apartment together, adjusting shelves, tightening loose knobs, tending to small domestic details. Under his careful hands, even these simple tasks took on a different quality, like a soft, unspoken rhythm we'd both fallen into. As he worked, I noticed the details. The slight furrow of his brow when he concentrated. The precision of his movements, the warmth in his smile when I laughed at my own awkward attempts to help. Each moment carried a subtle intimacy, one that didn't demand or rush, but settled slowly, building trust through presence alone. By the time he finished, the room felt changed, warmer, more awake, fuller in a way I hadn't anticipated. Jordan gathered his tools, then glanced back at me, his expression calm, steady, leaving the sense that something meaningful had passed between us, even if neither of us had spoken it aloud. "I'll be around if you need anything else," he said. There was something in his eyes as he spoke, unspoken, unforced. Not a promise exactly, but an acknowledgement. A gentle understanding of the connection that had begun to form without either of us naming it. I watched him go, the door closing softly behind him, and felt an unfamiliar blend of contentment and anticipation settle in my chest. The living room no longer felt like just another space in my apartment. It had become a place where something unexpected had taken root, fragile, perhaps, but unmistakably real. I poured myself a cup of tea and returned to the window, reflecting on the morning. It astonished me how a simple knock on the door could open something inside me, something I hadn't realized I kept shut for so long. There was no urgency in the feeling, no rush. Only the quiet awareness that something rare and beautiful had begun. Something not measured by time or circumstance, but by small, meaningful moments shared between two people. In the calm, steady light of the room, I found myself smiling. Life, even at 86, still had the capacity to surprise you, often when you least expected it. The days that followed Jordan's visits unfolded with a dreamlike softness. I began noticing details I had long overlooked. The way sunlight traced patterns across the worn wooden floor. The distant hum of traffic beyond the street. The faint scent of jasmine drifting in from the garden. And always, lingering just beneath my thoughts, was Jordan. His steady voice. The warmth in his eyes. The easy confidence that never intimidated, only invited trust. It was a Tuesday afternoon when he knocked again. I had been tending to the small herb garden on my balcony, my hands deep in the soil, when the familiar sound reached me. My heart skipped, not from surprise, but from anticipation. When I opened the door, there he stood, a small smile on his face, a brown paper bag resting in his hand. "Hello, Jacqueline," he said gently. "I thought you might like a few fresh supplies for your plants." And in that moment, I understood that this was no longer coincidence, but the quiet continuation of something already unfolding. I blinked, genuinely touched by the gesture. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said, feeling warmth rise to my cheeks. He stepped inside, setting the bag carefully on the counter. Once again, his presence filled the apartment, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a calm, grounding energy that settled into the rooms as if it belonged there. We moved out onto the balcony together, tending to the herbs side by side. The work itself was ordinary, watering, pruning, replanting, but there was a rhythm to it. A quiet coordination that made even the simplest motions feel shared. Meaningful. Jordan's hands were careful, brushing against mine now and then as we passed soil or adjusted pots. Each touch was brief, almost accidental, yet it sent a soft shiver through me. I caught myself smiling at the sensation, telling myself it was merely the novelty of company. But I knew better. It was something deeper. Something I hadn't allowed myself to name. "Your balcony is beautiful," he said softly, pausing to take it all in. "There's a kind of peace here that's hard to find." I laughed lightly, surprised by how free the sound felt. "I've always loved gardening," I replied. "It keeps me grounded, reminds me of time, of patience, of growth." My voice softened as I spoke, carrying memories I hadn't shared in a very long while. Jordan nodded, his gaze lingering on mine just a moment longer than necessary. "It suits you," he said. And I realized then that he wasn't talking about the plants or the space. He was talking about me. The realization tightened my chest. An unfamiliar warmth spreading slowly, deliberately. He saw me, not as I had been, not as time had shaped me, but as I was now. We talked quietly after that. About the small joys and inevitable challenges of life. About books that had stayed with after the last page. About places we had visited. Or dreamed of visiting. Beneath the surface of our conversation, something unspoken continued to grow. A shared understanding that neither of us was simply filling time. There was depth here. An emotional closeness that felt unexpected, yet natural. It strengthened with every exchanged glance, every gentle smile. At one point, Jordan paused, kneeling to adjust a small plant. I found myself noticing the line of his jaw, the calm strength in his arms, the way his attention seemed to extend beyond the task at hand, to the space around him, to the moment, to me. And in that quiet pause, I felt it clearly: whatever was unfolding between us was no longer fleeting. It was deliberate. And it was quietly changing us both. My heart fluttered, and with it came a wave of vulnerability I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. It surprised me with its strength, its suddenness. "Jacqueline," he said softly, rising and turning to face me. There was a gravity in his voice now, a gentleness layered with intention, that made me lean closer without conscious thought. "I know this may sound forward," he continued, "but I enjoy being here with you more than I expected to." The honesty of it caught my breath. There was no bravado in his tone, no assumption. Only truth offered carefully, as though he understood how fragile moments like this could be. I feel the same, I admitted. The words felt unfamiliar on my tongue, yet freeing, as if I were finally allowing myself to name something real. There was no urgency between us, no expectation. Only the quiet recognition of a shared feeling, tender, tentative, and deeply human. For a while we simply stood there, side by side, looking at the herbs, the city stretching beyond the balcony, and occasionally at one another with a growing, unspoken closeness. Time seemed to loosen its grip, holding us in a delicate balance between curiosity and courage, between longing and respect. Jordan lifted his hand and gently brushed a loose strand of hair from my face. The touch was light, deliberate, restrained, and it sent a soft tremor across my skin. I didn't pull away. Instead, I leaned into the moment, savoring the quiet connection, the trust that had formed without force or demand. I haven't felt this alive in a very long time, I whispered, almost afraid to hear the words aloud. You're not alone, he replied, his voice steady, warm with understanding I hadn't known I was seeking. Not anymore. The rest of the afternoon unfolded in easy companionship. We tended the balcony, shared stories, laughed gently at small mishaps. It was the kind of intimacy that didn't require constant conversation, one that existed comfortably in shared silence. Beneath it all, an awareness continued to grow. A deepening emotional bond, unexpected yet unmistakably welcome. As evening approached, Jordan gathered his things. He lingered by the door, that familiar hesitation settling between us once more. I'll see you tomorrow, he asked, hope threading quietly through his voice. Yes, I replied, my own voice soft but certain. I'd like that. When he left, I closed the door and rested against it, letting the stillness wrap around me. There was anticipation, yes, but more than that, there was something steadier. A sense of connection, of being met emotionally, in a way that made even the simplest moments of life feel newly meaningful. And I knew, with a calm certainty, that whatever lay ahead had already changed me. Good evening, Jacqueline, he said, his voice calm, yet carrying a resonance that tugged quietly at my chest. He stepped inside, each movement measured, deliberate, aware, the way he always was around me. Attentive, yet respectful, never pressing, never overstepping. We settled into the living room, sitting across from one another. A soft space between us that somehow felt charged with familiarity, and an unspoken connection. The conversation began lightly, drifting over trivialities, the weather, the small routines of life, but gradually it shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward something deeper. Something we didn't need to name aloud to understand. Jordan reached across the small expanse of the couch, his hand brushing mine in a deliberate, careful gesture. My pulse quickened. A warmth swept through me, unrelated to the flickering candlelight. I didn't pull back. Instead, I found myself leaning in, just slightly, instinctively, drawn toward the quiet intimacy of the moment. The way presence itself could feel like touch. Jacqueline, he said softly, his eyes holding a gravity I hadn't seen before. I know I came into your life unexpectedly, but I can't deny that being here with you feels right. I swallowed, suddenly aware of the dryness in my throat, of my heart racing in a rhythm that was at once exhilarating and terrifying. I feel the same, I whispered, the words barely leaving my lips, carrying more than I intended, more than I thought I could allow myself to admit. For a long moment, the room seemed to hold its breath with us. The candlelight flickered across the walls, casting a gentle glow over Jordan's face, illuminating the warmth in his expression, the sincerity in his gaze. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm. The streets, the years, the long stretches of routine, they all seemed to dissolve. For that fleeting, sacred moment, there was only this, the soft space between us, the steady rise and fall of our breathing, and the quiet, undeniable weight of something beginning to bloom. He reached for my hand again, his touch gentle, deliberate, so careful that it made me ache with anticipation. I want to be careful, he said softly, his voice steady, measured. Because what we have, what I hope we have, deserves that. I nodded, feeling a tremor behind my eyes. Tears pricked at the corners, not from sadness, but from the intensity of recognition. The rare and fragile feeling of being truly seen, valued, after decades of keeping myself guarded. I understand, I whispered. And I want that too. For a long while, we simply sat like that, hands entwined, breathing almost in sync, sharing a quiet intimacy that needed no words. Every glance, every subtle touch, carried meaning, a tender acknowledgement of trust, of connection. For the first time in years, I felt fully present, alive. As though the long stretches of solitude, the rhythms of routine, the quiet reflections of a lifetime, had been preparing me for this moment. Eventually, Jordan rose, extending a hand to help me up. "May I?" he asked, his gesture cautious, respectful, the tip of his fingers hovering near my waist. I smiled, heart fluttering, and nodded. In that simple movement, the room seemed to pulse with an almost imperceptible energy. Soft electric. A delicate weaving of desire and emotional connection that was both exhilarating and comforting. We moved together slowly, carefully into a gentle embrace. His hands were strong, yet tender, guiding without force, holding without imposing. A shiver ran through me, not merely physical, but emotional. This wasn't fleeting attraction. This was recognition, understanding. A quiet meeting of two souls, the kind of connection that doesn't need explanation. That doesn't need to rush. It was a culmination of everything: patience, presence, and the subtle awakening of something I had thought lost to time. A profound trust settled between us. I felt seen, desired, and respected in equal measure, and that made the moment feel sacred. As the evening unfolded, we simply held each other. Words came in whispers, stories, quiet confessions, laughter shared across the small space of the living room. There was no rush, no expectation. Just two people, unexpectedly intertwined, discovering the beauty of connection in its honest, vulnerable form. When he finally left, the apartment was bathed in the soft stillness of night. The city beyond the windows shimmered with distant lights and a faint hum of life, as though it, too, acknowledged the change that had quietly taken place within me. I closed the door slowly, leaning against it, a smile spreading across my face. A sense of peace settled over me that I hadn't felt in decades. I had never imagined that at 86, life could surprise me in such a delicate, yet powerful way. That a simple flickering light could lead to something so profound. Could intimacy so respectful and alive with meaning. I moved to the window and gazed out over the quiet streets. A warmth bloomed in my chest, deeper than anything physical, emotional, spiritual. A testament to the unexpected joys life can offer, even in its later years. Jordan had entered my home as a stranger, yet he had left a mark I would carry forever. A reminder that it is never too late, for connection, for trust, or even for love. And as I watched the soft glow of the city reflect in my eyes, I whispered a quiet, grateful acknowledgement to the nightlife, even at 86, still holds magic. All it requires is an open heart, a small act of courage, and someone willing to see you, truly see you, beyond the routine, beyond the ordinary.